The sound of raindrops hitting the concrete filled the silence of the night. Under a damp, gloomy overpass, Vittorio, his face marked by time and pain, pulled his worn coat against the cold. Beside him, Loop, a brown dog with a piercing gaze, watched him loyally. It was a scene of solitude, a life that many would go by without noticing, but which carried a story that few could imagine. There was a time when Vittorio was the man everyone wanted to be, a millionaire, a successful business owner, and the resident of a mansion that seemed to have come out of a fairy tale. He had everything money could buy, but that did not prepare him for the tragedy that would change his life forever. "Just a little longer, Loop," he murmured, stroking the dog's head. "Just one more day." As he walked through the dark streets and avoided the gazes of strangers, his mind wandered back to the past. He remembered the happy days, the innocent laughter of his son echoing through the halls of the mansion, the promises of a bright future, promises he could not keep. Guilt was a burden he carried every day. Work, he always coming first, stole the time he should have dedicated to his son. And when cruel fate took the boy, all that was left was a void impossible to fill. Now, Vittorio was a shell of the man he once was. His torn shoes, once a status symbol, were a metaphor for the fall he had suffered. But Loop, always by his side, seemed to understand his pain in a way no human could. As the rain thickened, he found refuge under the overpass. It was a cold and inhospitable place, but for Vittorio, it was the closest thing he had to home. He sat on the ground, pulling Loop close, and let the memories flood his mind. "It was supposed to be different," he whispered, his voice breaking. His normally dull eyes filled with tears. He spoke to no one, but to the emptiness around him, as if he could reach his lost son, somewhere beyond the pain. Loop let out a soft moan and rested his head on Vittorio's lap, offering the only comfort he had in this cold and unforgiving world. Meanwhile, above them, the lights of cars passed, indifferent to the man and his dog, who struggled to find a reason to go on. What had happened to a man who seemed to have everything? How could life change so quickly and leave someone on the brink of the abyss? These questions echoed in Vittorio's mind, and perhaps in some way, they also resonated with those watching. For everyone has faced losses, regrets, or choices that shaped their lives in unexpected ways. "Why are we still here, Loop?" he asked softly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. The dog looked up at him, with eyes that seemed to say, "Because there is still something to fight for." But Vittorio wasn't sure if he still believed that. He didn't know if he had the strength to carry on. And that night, under the viaduct, he wondered, is there still hope for someone like me? The first light of dawn illuminated the city, but for Vittorio, the brightness was a cruel reminder of his reality. He stood up slowly, his bones feeling heavy, and the cold still clinging to his skin. Beside him, Loop stretched, wagging his tail slightly, as if trying to bring some warmth to that cold, colorless day. Vittorio's reflection in a puddle of water caught his attention. He barely recognized the man he saw. His disheveled hair, his face covered in wrinkles and dirt marks, his empty gaze, a stark contrast to the confident businessman who had appeared on the covers of magazines just a few years ago. As he walked through the deserted streets, avoiding curious glances, his mind went back to the moments before the tragedy. He remembered how his son had insisted that they go fishing together, but he had always put it off. "Later, son. I'm busy now." Those words echoed like a hammer in his mind, growing heavier and heavier. And then came that fateful day, an accident that took his son away forever. Vittorio was stuck in a business meeting when he got the call. He didn't make it in time to say goodbye. He didn't make it in time to save what really mattered. That guilt consumed him daily. He believed that his obsession with building an empire was the reason for his loss, as if fate had given him everything only to take it all back. "He was supposed to be here, Loop," Vittorio murmured as he stroked the dog. "He was supposed to be here with me." Loop, as always, didn't respond with words, but tilted her head and looked at him with understanding eyes. It was a silent connection that kept Vittorio grounded, even on edge. As he wandered, he passed the windows of luxury stores, with elegant clothes and accessories shining under the artificial lights. Things that had once been part of his life, everyday life. But now they were just ghosts of an unreachable past. He looked away, trying to ignore the lump in his throat. The streets were starting to fill with people hurrying to work. They passed him by without noticing, some avoiding him as if he were invisible, others giving him judgmental glances. Failure. He knew what they were thinking. He knew because he thought the same about himself. Hunger was starting to bother him. Vittorio searched his pockets and found a few coins. It wasn't enough for a coffee, but maybe he could buy a loaf of bread. He walked to a bakery that was just opening, the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee invading his senses and bringing a pang of nostalgia. With the little he had, he bought a loaf of bread and returned to a wooden bench in the nearby park. He shared the bread with Loop, who devoured it quickly, while Vittorio just nibbled on his piece, distracted by the memories. There, sitting on the bench, he stared into space. There were no plans, no ambitions, just pain and the incessant question, why am I still here? The rain from the night before had left the air chilly, but he barely felt the cold. The weight of his loneliness was much greater. "Maybe this is how things are supposed to be," he said softly, looking at Loop. "Just you and me, until the end." But as the shadows of despair surrounded him, a glimmer of hope, albeit distant, began to form. A reminder that sometimes the unexpected can appear, even in the darkest moments. The afternoon arrived with a sky heavy with gray clouds, but the city did not stop. Vittorio, sitting on his usual bench in the park, watched the people hurry by, each in their own world. He was invisible, a ghost that no one noticed. Loop, beside him, growled softly but not in threat. It was more like a warning. Vittorio looked around, and saw a female figure approaching. She carried a colorful umbrella that contrasted with the gray surroundings, and her expression was soft but firm. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, in a voice that seemed filled with genuine concern. Vittorio hesitated. It had been months since anyone had spoken to him like this, without judgment or contempt. He looked away, embarrassed, trying to hide his vulnerability. "I'm fine," he replied almost inaudibly. But Loop, as if sensing that this woman brought something different, barked softly, catching her attention. "Is that your dog?" she asked with a slight smile. "He seems very loyal." Vittorio nodded, patting Loop's head. "He's the only one who's stayed by my side." The woman crouched down a little, keeping a respectful distance, but her eyes fixed on Vittorio. "If you need help, I'll be nearby," she said, leaving a card on a nearby bench. "Don't be shy. Sometimes all you need is someone who cares." Before he could respond, she stood up and walked away, leaving him alone with Loop again. For a moment, Vittorio stared at the card. His trembling hands finally picked it up. It read, "Church of St. Francis, help for those in need." He sighed, putting the card in his pocket. Part of him wanted to tear it up. Another, quieter part, wondered if this could be the chance he needed. Night fell, and with it, the biting cold. Back on the overpass, Vittorio huddled against the concrete, Loop in his arms. The memory of that woman and her words echoed in his mind. Why would she care? What did she see in me? Loop let out a soft moan, as if to say, maybe you should try. But Vittorio didn't know if he had the strength to believe it. He closed his eyes, trying to convince himself that he didn't need help. That pride was his last line of defense. Yet, deep down in his soul, something was beginning to change. It wasn't a complete transformation, but a small spark. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning brought a bitter cold, and Vittorio woke with aching bones after yet another night under the overpass. Loop, as always, was by his side, stretching and wagging his tail, trying to bring some cheer to his owner. As they walked through the streets, Vittorio noticed something unusual. A van pulled up near the overpass, and 3 figures got out, carrying boxes and bags. He instinctively stepped away, pulling Loop into the shadows. What were these people doing here? "Hey, buddy," called a calm, friendly male voice. "We're here to help. Do you need something warm to eat?" Vittorio didn't answer right away. He watched warily, his natural distrust keeping him from approaching. But Loop, as if sensing something different, wagged his tail and took a few steps forward, breaking the ice. "We are volunteers from the Church of St. Francis," the man continued, as he bent down to be closer to Vittorio's level, but keeping a respectful distance. He held out a bag. "There's some fresh bread and a blanket here. It's not much, but it might help." Vittorio hesitated, looking at the bag as if it were a strange object. It was the first time in months that someone had offered him something without asking for anything in return. With shaking hands, he finally accepted it. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice almost cracking. The man, who introduced himself as Marco, smiled warmly. "If you need more, we're at St. Francis Church every night. There's food, clothes, and a warm place. You're welcome to come anytime." As Marco and the other volunteers walked away, Vittorio stood there, holding the bag. He opened it, and the aroma of fresh bread filled his senses. His stomach growled loudly, but he lingered longer, studying the blanket, touching the soft fabric as if it were a rare treasure. Lupi approached, curious, and Vittorio tore off a piece of bread, handing it to the dog before eating the rest. Each bite seemed to carry not just physical warmth, but something deeper, a glimpse of humanity he had forgotten. That night, as he huddled under his new blanket, Vittorio looked at Loop. "Maybe they're right," he whispered, stroking the dog's head. "Maybe there's still something to fight for." But the doubt was still there, like a lingering shadow. He knew that to change his life, he would have to take a bigger step, accept the help that was offered. And that would require something he wasn't sure he still had: courage. The day dawned gray, but not as cold as the previous ones. Vittorio, still hesitant, put the blanket he had been given back in the bag and looked at Loop. The dog seemed more excited than usual, as if he knew something important was about to happen. "What if it's a trap, Loop?" he murmured, stroking the dog's head. "What if it's just another disappointment?" Loop responded with a soft bark, as if to say, "Let's try." The card for the Church of St. Francis was in his pocket, and Marco's words echoed in his mind. "You're welcome to come anytime." Still, each step toward the church felt like a monumental effort. He wasn't sure he was ready to face other people, to admit that he needed help. The busy morning streets enveloped him in a sense of anonymity. No one noticed him, no one cared. But this time, it didn't bother him. He was focused on reaching the destination that could change everything. As he turned the corner, he saw the church. It was a simple red brick building with a small cross on top. The door was ajar, and the soft sounds of voices and laughter escaped from inside. Vittorio stopped, taking a deep breath. "You can do it," he told himself, though his voice sounded more like a plea than a statement. As he stepped through the door, the warmth of the room enveloped him. The smell of coffee and fresh bread hit him first, followed by the sight of people chatting animatedly, some setting tables and others helping with clothes and food. Marco spotted him from afar and smiled warmly. "Vittorio, I'm so glad you came." He walked toward the man, taking his time, respecting Vittorio's space. "I'm glad you decided to show up." "I don't know if I can stay," Vittorio replied, his voice almost trailing off. Marco nodded understandingly. "Okay, just being here is a big step. Come, sit down. We have coffee and something to eat." Unsure of how to refuse, Vittorio sat down at one of the simple tables. Lupe remained by his side, receiving a bowl of fresh water and a piece of bread, specially for him. As he sipped the hot coffee, Vittorio felt something he had long forgotten: comfort. Marco returned and sat down beside him. "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. Everyone here has their own time. We're just happy to be of help." Marco's words were a relief. For the first time in months, Vittorio felt like he didn't have to justify his pain or explain his downfall. He looked around and saw other people like him, men and women, who were carrying the weight of their own battles, but who were there, trying. "I lost everything," Vittorio whispered, more to himself than to Marco. "And now, you're trying to find something new," Marco replied softly. "And that's what matters." Later that day, as Vittorio was getting ready to leave, Marco called out to him. "Tomorrow we'll start a new recycling project. It's simple work, but honest. If you want to try, you're welcome." Vittorio hesitated. Work? He hadn't done it in so long that the idea seemed unrealistic, but something about the way Marco was looking at him, no judgment, just hope, made him nod. "Okay," he replied. "I'll try." As he walked back to the overpass, Lupe at his side, Vittorio felt something different. It wasn't a complete transformation, but a small flame was beginning to burn inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could start over. The first day of work on the recycling project arrived, and Vittorio was nervous. He woke up early on the overpass, helped by the enthusiasm of Lupe, who wagged his tail and seemed to understand that something important was coming. Dressed in clean clothes that he had received at church, Vittorio felt different, as if he were recovering a part of himself. At the entrance to the church, Marco was already waiting for him with a wheelbarrow and some reusable bags. "Ready to start?" Marco asked with his usual warm smile. Vittorio nodded, still shy. "Ready." The task was simple. Collect bottles, cans, and other recyclable materials from the streets of the neighborhood. With Lupe always by his side, they walked through the streets, while Marco and other volunteers guided him. It was a humble job, but for Vittorio, each bottle put in the cart felt like a small step forward in his journey. But as he walked, he began to notice something strange about Lupe. The normally energetic dog was slowing down, stopping frequently and breathing heavily. Vittorio tried to ignore it, thinking it was just fatigue, but deep down, he felt a twinge of worry. When the day was over, Vittorio took Lupe back to the overpass. The dog was visibly exhausted, barely able to lift his head. Vittorio felt his heart sink. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, stroking Lupe's soft fur. The next morning, things got worse. Lupe could barely stand up, and his breathing was heavy. Vittorio didn't have the money to take the dog to a vet, and despair began to set in. He looked at Lupe, who was staring at him with tired but loyal eyes. "You're all I have," Vittorio whispered, feeling the tears welling up. Without a second thought, he ran to the church, where he found Marco sorting through clothes. "Marco, I need help," he said, his voice breaking. Marco immediately saw the desperation on his face. "What happened?" "It's Loop," Vittorio explained. "He's in bad shape. I can't lose him." Marco put his hand on Vittorio's shoulder. "We have a vet who helps with our project. We're going to take Loop there now." Within minutes, Loop was in a van with Vittorio and Marco. During the ride, Vittorio kept his hand on the dog, trying to calm him. "Hang in there, buddy. We'll get through this together." At the vet's office, a middle-aged man with a knowing gaze examined Loop. "He's dehydrated and weak. He'll need to stay in the hospital for a few days for tests and treatment," the vet explained. The thought of being without Loop was unbearable for Vittorio, but he knew it was the only way to save his friend. "Please, do whatever it takes," he pleaded. Over the next few days, Vittorio divided his time between working on the recycling project and visiting the vet's clinic. He would sit next to Loop, holding his paw and telling him about the day's small victories. "We're doing well, Loop, but I need you to come back soon. I can't do this alone." The other volunteers noticed the change in Vittorio. He was quieter, more thoughtful. Marco, always attentive, tried to offer support. "Loop is strong, Vittorio. He'll get through this, and so will you." Finally, after a week of uncertainty, the vet brought good news. Loop responded well to the treatment. "He's still weak, but I think he'll be fine." Vittorio felt such a wave of relief that he couldn't hold back the tears. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my friend." When Loop was finally discharged, he was thinner, but the same sparkle in his eyes remained. Vittorio hugged him tightly, feeling a gratitude he couldn't put into words. "Let's get back to work, mate," he said with a smile. "We still have a lot to do." Loop's return brought renewed energy to Vittorio. With his faithful friend by his side, he felt he could face any challenge. Loop's recovery wasn't just a relief. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a chance to start over. The sun shone brightly on the morning that Vittorio and Loop returned to work on the recycling project. Loop, still a little thinner, wagged his tail with the same energy as always, as if to show everyone that he was ready to keep going. Vittorio felt something different that day. There was a renewed purpose in every step, as if Loop's recovery had lit a new flame in his heart. In the neighborhood, people began to notice Vittorio's constant presence. Residents who had previously ignored him now waved to him with kind smiles. A few children ran to play with Loop as he walked through the streets with his wheelbarrow. "You're doing a great job," said an elderly woman, handing over a bag of recyclable bottles. "It's good to see people like you helping take care of the neighborhood." These words, though simple, meant a lot to Vittorio. Each gesture of recognition was a reminder that he was no longer just a man lost in the shadows. He was becoming an important part of the community. With the support of Marco and other volunteers, works on the recycling project began to gain momentum. The collected materials were taken to the community center, where they were sorted and sent for recycling. Little by little, the space was transforming into a gathering place for the community, with activities for children and workshops for adults. One sunny afternoon, Marco invited Vittorio to a meeting at the community center. "I have something to show you," he said with an enigmatic smile. When he arrived, Vittorio was surprised to see a group of residents and volunteers gathered together, holding handmade signs with messages of thanks. "Grazie, Vittorio. You inspire us. The neighborhood is better because of you." He was speechless. I don't know what to say," he began, his voice breaking. Marco put a hand on his shoulder. You did it, Vittorio. You changed not only your life, but the lives of so many people around you. That's the impact of your work." Applause filled the simple hall, and Vittorio felt tears well up. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude and pride. In the midst of the celebration, Loop ran among the children, receiving affection and attention from everyone. He was also a symbol of the strength and resilience that Vittorio demonstrated every day. Later, as he watched the people laugh and talk, Vittorio reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who once believed he had nothing left to live for was now a recognized leader, someone people looked up to. Marco approached him again, smiling. "This is just the beginning, my friend. We have so much more to build." Vittorio nodded, his heart filled with determination. "Yes, and this time, I know I'm not alone." The evening was quiet in the community center, lit by simple but warm lights. The event celebrating the recycling project's achievements had ended a few hours ago. The excited voices of families and the laughter of children still echoed in Vittorio's mind as he, now alone, organized the space with Loop by his side. The dog lay down next to him, watching with watchful eyes. It was as if Loop, too, sensed that this moment was not just the end of an event, but the beginning of something much greater. Vittorio sat down in a nearby chair, exhausted but with a light heart. He looked around, taking in the empty hall that just a few months ago had been nothing more than an abandoned space. Now, it was a symbol of rebirth for the community and for himself. "Remember when we were on the overpass, Loop?" Vittorio asked, stroking the dog's head. "I thought there was nothing left. I thought the world had forgotten me." Loop barked softly, as if confirming that he too remembered those dark days. "But look where we are now," Vittorio continued, his voice choked with emotion. "All of this because some people believed in me, and because you never gave up." The memory of Marco, Elena, and even the stranger who had offered him help months ago filled his mind. Every small gesture, every word of support had become an essential part of building his new life. He looked out the window at the stars, a shy smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, the future looked bright. Not because he had everything under control, but because he knew he was no longer alone. The next day, Vittorio gathered the team of volunteers and proposed new plans for the project. He wanted to expand the activities, create new opportunities for the residents, and strengthen the bonds between everyone. During the meeting, Marco smiled. "You have become the heart of this place, Vittorio. I don't think even you realize the impact you have." The following weeks were full of work and challenges, but also of progress. Vittorio learned that starting over was not an easy path, but that every step, no matter how small, made a difference. He also understood that his true purpose was not just to find meaning in his life, but to help others find theirs. That evening, as he finished another day of work, Vittorio sat on a park bench with Loop by his side. He looked out at the trees swaying in the wind, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. "One day at a time," he murmured, stroking Loop. "We've come this far, and who knows where else we can go." This heartwarming story shows us that even in the darkest moments, small acts of kindness can rekindle the light within us. If you were inspired, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of overcoming and hope. Until the next chapter.